What happens when a teacher, blinded by arrogance, forces a student onto the football field just to humiliate him, only to uncover a shocking truth? This is the story of Ryan, a quiet, unassuming boy with a hidden talent that would leave an entire school in awe. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and share it with someone who needs to hear this, because everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth. Now, let's begin, and prepare yourself for a roller coaster of emotions. Ryan was different, small, quiet, and always lost in his own world. In a school where strength and popularity ruled, he was invisible, a shadow among giants, a name forgotten before it was even remembered. He didn't mind, at least, that's what he told himself. But deep inside, there was a longing, a desperate wish to just exist without being a target. He wasn't like the other boys. He didn't tower over his classmates with broad shoulders and booming voices. He didn't throw a football effortlessly across the field, earning cheers and high fives. No, Ryan walked the halls with his head down, his books clutched tightly to his chest like armor. Because in a school like this, the moment you stood out was the moment you got torn down. But no matter how much Ryan tried to blend in, to disappear, some people make it their mission to find the weakest link. And that person was Coach Miller. The gym smelled like sweat and old leather. The kind of place where boys were turned into real men, as the coach liked to say. Ryan never felt more out of place. He stood in the back, hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie, hoping, praying, that no one would notice him. But fate had other plans. The voice cut through the air like a whip. Ryan froze. His heart pounded so hard he thought the entire gym could hear it. Slowly, he lifted his head, only to meet the sharp, knowing gaze of Coach Miller, a gaze that held something cruel beneath the surface. A smirk curled at the edge of the coach's lips, a predator who had just found his prey. Let's see if he can even hold a football. Laughter erupted, a wave of it, loud, mocking, relentless. It bounced off the walls, grew, swallowed him whole. Ryan could feel their eyes burning into him, some filled with amusement, others with pity, but none with kindness. His hands clenched into fists, fingernails digging into his palms. He wanted to run, to disappear, but his legs felt like lead. Come on, don't be shy, the coach taunted, tossing the ball in Ryan's direction. It spun in slow motion, an executioner's axe descending. Ryan reached out on instinct, but the ball smacked against his chest and tumbled to the ground with an echoing thud. More laughter, a chorus of humiliation. Ryan swallowed the lump in his throat. He knew how this worked. If he reacted, if he showed even the smallest flicker of emotion, it would only get worse. That was the rule of survival. But he wasn't just fighting the stares of his classmates. He was fighting the voice in his own head. You're weak. You don't belong here. You never did. Coach Miller let out a long, exaggerated sigh. Typical. He turned to the class. And this is why some kids never make it in life. No strength. No courage. Just nothing. The words weren't loud, but they cut deep. Deeper than any punch, any shove, any whispered insult in the hallways. Because this wasn't just about football. It was about proving his worth. And in this moment, Ryan felt like he had none. The other students smirked, some nudging each other, reveling in the entertainment. To them, this was just another day, another victim, another forgettable moment that they bring up at lunch before moving on with their lives. But for Ryan, this moment would stay with him forever. He forced himself to pick up the football, the leather rough against his shaking fingers. He could feel every second stretch into an eternity. His breathing was uneven. He wanted to scream, to throw the ball back in the coach's face, to do something. But all he could do was stand there, frozen in the weight of his own inadequacy. Coach Miller chuckled, shaking his head. That's enough. The final judgment. The final nail in the coffin. Ryan wasn't sure what hurt more, the coach's words or the fact that no one stood up for him. What Ryan didn't know was that this moment would change everything. Humiliation. It wasn't just a consequence. It was the plan. Coach Miller didn't just want Ryan to fail. He wanted him to crumble. He wanted to peel away whatever scraps of dignity the boy had left and expose him, raw and defenseless, to an audience that thrived on weakness. It wasn't enough that Ryan had already been laughed at, that the weight of their stares had pressed down on him like 1,000 bricks. No, Coach Miller wasn't done. He caught the ball with one hand, spinning it in his fingers as if he were holding something trivial, something Ryan could never hope to master. And then, with a smirk, he tossed it towards him. "Run," the coach said, his voice laced with mockery. "Show us what you've got." The words weren't just an order. They were a challenge. A dare. A trap. The gym fell silent. The team, strong, confident, untouchable, stood watching, waiting, expecting the inevitable. Failure. Ryan's heart pounded against his ribs. The football sat in his hands, foreign and unwelcome. His fingers curled around the rough leather, feeling the grooves, the laces pressing into his skin. It was heavier than he expected, as if it carried all the weight of his fears, his doubts, his years of being the invisible kid who only existed in the background. Should he run? Should he walk away? Would that be worse? The coach's sneer deepened. The team shifted, some crossing their arms, some nudging each other with grins that spoke louder than words. "What's the matter, scared?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, low and cruel. The kind that didn't just mock but sank into your skin, reminding you that no matter what you did, no matter how hard you tried, you would never belong. Ryan swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. He could feel his hands shaking, but he couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else. Something deeper. Something even he didn't understand yet. This wasn't just about running. It wasn't just about playing football. It was about proving, once and for all, that he was exactly what they thought he was. Weak. Coach Miller sighed, loud and exaggerated, shaking his head like he was watching a pathetic excuse for an athlete. "Come on, kid, it's simple. You take the ball. You run. Or is that too complicated?" More laughter. More whispers. More of that crushing weight pressing down on him. Ryan gritted his teeth. His legs felt locked in place, his muscles stiff, unwilling. He could feel every eye on him, every expectation of failure. And the worst part was, he almost believed it. Almost. But then, something stirred. A flicker. A pulse of something different. Something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Something buried. A memory, maybe. The kind that existed just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. Ryan took a breath. It felt sharp in his lungs, cold, electric. And without thinking, without even fully understanding why, he moved. The gym blurred around him. The sounds, the voices, the laughter. It all faded into something distant, something meaningless. His feet hit the ground in quick, light steps, faster than he expected, smoother than he had ever moved before. For the first time in his life, Ryan wasn't thinking about what came next. He just ran. The defenders in front of him shifted, ready, certain they could take him down. But then, Ryan dodged. A sharp cut to the right, a movement so clean, so instinctual, it startled even him. The first player lunged, missed. The second reached out, too slow. Gasps replaced laughter. The sneers faltered. Eyes widened. Ryan didn't understand what was happening. His body moved on its own, weaving, shifting, finding spaces where there should have been none. His heart pounded, not from fear but from something else, adrenaline. Power. Something he had never felt before. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. Ryan stopped, breathless, staring at the stunned faces around him. The gym was silent. Completely. Utterly. Silent. And in that moment, Ryan realized something. He wasn't the only one who had just felt it. They had too. Even Coach Miller. For the first time, the laughter was gone. The whispers had stopped. The mocking eyes were now filled with something else. Something Ryan had never seen before. Doubt. Fear. And just a hint of respect. Coach Miller's smirk was gone. His arms were crossed. His expression unreadable. But Ryan could see it. He could feel it. This wasn't the reaction the coach had expected. It wasn't the humiliation he had planned. Something had shifted. Something had changed. And it was only the beginning. And then, it happened. One step, then another. And in an instant, Ryan was gone. Not in the way they expected. Not in the way they had seen countless others struggle, trip, or stumble under pressure. No, this was something else. Something impossible. Something that should not, could not, have come from him. A blur. A streak of lightning weaving through defenders like they were standing still. The moment his feet touched the ground, it was as if time had shifted. The gym, once loud and suffocating with laughter, now held only silence. The defenders, bigger, stronger, confident, moved to stop him. But they weren't fast enough. They weren't anything enough. One reached out, expecting an easy stop, only to grasp at empty air. Another lunged, sure he had the angle, only to find himself off balance as Ryan slipped past, weightless, untouchable. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was precision, movements calculated by instinct, sharper than any practice drill, smoother than anything even the best players had trained for. The laughter? Gone. The smirks? Faded. In their place, a stunned, heavy silence. A silence thick enough to feel. Gasps filled the air, quiet at first, then growing as realization sank in. The same players who had mocked him, who had expected nothing but humiliation, now stood frozen, wide-eyed, jaws slightly open, watching something they couldn't comprehend. And then, Coach Miller's voice broke the silence, filled with something that had never been there before: disbelief. What was that? Ryan stood at the goal line, his chest rising and falling, his breath heavy, his mind racing. His hands trembled, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from something else. Shock. Because he had never done that before. Not like this. Not with this kind of speed, this kind of control, this kind of power. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't have made sense. He had never trained, never practiced. He had spent his life avoiding sports, avoiding attention, avoiding this exact moment. And yet, his body had known exactly what to do. Like it had been waiting. Waiting for him to move. Waiting for him to stop doubting and just run. And now, as he turned back to face them, he saw something in their eyes. A shift. A crack in the way they saw him. A crack in the way he saw himself. This was supposed to be his humiliation. His downfall. The moment they would carry with them, laughing, for years to come. Instead, it was something else entirely. Coach Miller took a step forward, his expression unreadable. But Ryan saw it. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the unwilling realization forming behind his eyes. He wasn't just seeing Ryan anymore. He was noticing him. For the first time, the team was silent. No taunts. No jeers. No words at all. Because what could they say? What words existed to explain what had just happened? Ryan wasn't just fast. He wasn't just lucky. He had moved with something beyond talent. Something that shouldn't have belonged to someone like him. And yet it did. The air was thick with something different now. Not mockery. Not dismissal. But curiosity. A strange, hesitant, uncomfortable curiosity that settled over every single person in that gym. Even Ryan himself. Because he knew, deep down, in a place he had never dared explore, that this was only the beginning. Coach Miller's plan had backfired. This was no ordinary kid. This was talent, raw, untamed, and terrifyingly fast. But instead of admitting he was wrong, the coach wanted to use him. "You're on the team now," Coach declared. Not as an apology, not out of respect, but as a test. Could he control this boy? Could he break him down and mold him into a tool for his own pride? And Ryan? He wasn't sure what scared him more, the coach's sudden interest or the power he had just discovered inside himself. Every practice, every drill, every grueling second beneath the scorching sun, Coach Miller was relentless. Again, Ryan's breath hitched, his lungs screaming for air. Faster. His legs burned, muscles tightening, body aching. Harder. The ball slammed into his hands with brutal force. He gritted his teeth. Push forward. Again, and again, and again. Coach Miller didn't just want Ryan to play. He didn't just want him to improve. No, that wasn't enough. He wanted to own him, to break him down, to make him a tool, his tool. And Ryan knew it. The coach's eyes, once filled with disdain, now held something else, something colder. Possession. Control. He saw Ryan as an asset now, a weapon to be sharpened and wielded at will. And for a while, Ryan let him. He ran when he was told. He trained like they wanted. He followed the orders. Because deep down he still carried that fear, that old voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was the only way to belong. But something inside him was changing. The fear that once paralyzed him was now fuel. The hesitation that once held him back had turned into something sharper, something more dangerous. He wasn't just running anymore. He was chasing something that had always been just out of reach. A version of himself he had never dared to believe in. The boy they mocked was gone, and in his place stood something unstoppable. It all led to this. The big game. The moment that would decide everything. The field stretched before him, a battleground beneath the bright stadium lights. The roar of the crowd was deafening. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air, pressing down like a storm waiting to break. Ryan stood at the edge of it all, staring down the field, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just a game. It was a reckoning. For Coach Miller, it was proof that he had created something, a player forged under his iron grip. For the team, it was the moment they would finally claim victory. And for Ryan, it was the last test. Was he still the boy they had mocked? The boy they had overlooked? The boy they had forced into this world, thinking he would crumble under the weight of it? Or was he something else entirely? The whistle blew. The world slowed. And Ryan ran. They tried to stop him. Bigger players. Stronger players. The kind that had spent years training for moments like this. But Ryan moved like nothing they had ever seen before. One cut, then another. His body wove through the chaos like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Defenders lunged, missed. Hands reached out, grasped at nothing but air. He was too fast, too sharp, too alive. Gasps echoed from the stands. The disbelief, the shock, it was everywhere, spreading through the stadium like wildfire. And on the sidelines, Coach Miller watched, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. Because he knew, this wasn't his doing. This wasn't his creation. This wasn't the result of his training, his drills, his control. This was Ryan. Raw, uncontained, untouchable. And for the first time, it wasn't just the opposing team that feared him. It was his own. Ryan hit the end zone. Touchdown. The stadium erupted. Cheers. Screams. Stunned disbelief. But Ryan barely heard any of it. His eyes searched, scanning, landing on the one person who mattered most in this moment. Coach Miller. The man who had tried to break him. The man who had tried to make him something he could control. But Ryan wasn't a tool. He wasn't a pawn. He wasn't a joke. And as he stood there, surrounded by a team that no longer knew what to make of him, by a crowd that would never see him the same way again, Ryan smiled. Because he had won. Not just the game, but something bigger, something deeper. Freedom. And nothing could take that away now. The roar of the crowd was deafening. The stadium lights burned like fire against the night sky, illuminating the battlefield below. And at the center of it all stood Ryan. Heart pounding, muscles tensed, eyes locked on the man who once tried to break him. Coach Miller. A man who had mocked him, pushed him, used him. A man who had believed, down to his very core, that Ryan would always be weak, always be beneath him. A man who was about to learn just how wrong he had been. The final play. Everything, the sweat, the pain, the doubt, the ridicule, had led to this moment. The ball snapped. And Ryan? He ran. But this wasn't just running. This was lightning. This was wind. This was power unleashed, unchained, undeniable. The defenders lunged, arms outstretched, desperate. Too slow. Ryan twisted, pivoted, and vanished through the gaps before they even realized they had missed. One after another, they collapsed to the ground, grasping at air, watching as the one player they never believed in tore through their strongest lines like they were nothing. His body moved on instinct, sharper than ever, like it was meant for this. Gasps filled the air. Disbelief. Shock. Panic. No one could touch him. No one could stop him. And then, the final defender. The last man standing between Ryan and victory. A mountain of a player. Fast. Brutal. The kind of player built to destroy. For a split second, their eyes met. And in that moment, Ryan saw it. The hesitation. The doubt creeping in. The fear. Because even he knew something about Ryan was different. Ryan cut left. The defender lunged. A collision was inevitable. The stadium held its breath. And then, Ryan did the impossible. He leaped. Not just a step. Not just a jump. He soared. A blur above the field. High above the outstretched arms of the last defender. Defying everything they thought they knew about him. The world seemed to slow, suspended in that one perfect second. And then he landed, feet hitting the turf, body rolling forward, the end zone just inches away. A desperate hand grabbed at his jersey, the last attempt to stop him. Too late. Ryan stretched forward, fingertips grazing the ground. Touchdown. Silence. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The weight of what had just happened crashing down like a tidal wave. And then, an explosion of sound. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Screams. People on their feet, shouting his name, chanting, celebrating. But Ryan barely heard it. He was still kneeling, his hand pressed against the turf, breath heavy, heart pounding. Because he had done it. Not for them. Not for Coach Miller. Not for the team that once laughed at him. For himself. Slowly, he rose to his feet. He turned, scanning the sea of faces, the flood of emotions. And then his eyes found him. Coach Miller. The man who once smirked at him. The man who once tossed him a football just to humiliate him. The man who had tried to own his talent. Now, his face was pale. His mouth slightly open. His fists clenched at his sides. His power, his pride, everything he had built his authority on, was shattered. Because Ryan hadn't just won the game. He had taken back everything that was ever stolen from him. As his teammates rushed toward him, lifting him onto their shoulders, chanting his name, Ryan closed his eyes for just a moment. He was never supposed to be here. He was never supposed to win. But sometimes, the ones they underestimate, the ones they push aside, the ones they try to break, are the ones who rise the highest. The quietest ones are often the most powerful. And tonight, everyone knew his name. Ryan. The boy who was never meant to fit in. The boy who became unstoppable. The world had changed. Not just for Ryan. Not just for the team. But for everyone who had ever doubted, ever judged, ever assumed they knew what someone was capable of. The kid they once laughed at was now their hero. Ryan sat on the shoulders of his teammates, their cheers ringing through the air like an anthem of victory. The same hands that once shoved him aside, the same voices that once whispered behind his back, now carried him with pride. His name echoed across the field, across the stands, across the very walls of the school that had never truly seen him before this night. But Ryan? He wasn't thinking about the cheers. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. His eyes were locked on one man, the man who had set all of this in motion. Coach Miller. The once smug, unshakable coach stood frozen on the sidelines. His arms were crossed, but his grip was tight, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched, his gaze unreadable. The man who once ruled with confidence now stood in the shadow of something he had never expected. Defeat? Maybe. But more than that, realization. He had tried to break Ryan, to mold him into something lesser, something controlled. But instead, Ryan had become something Coach Miller could never take credit for. Something that couldn't be owned, couldn't be manipulated. Greatness. And for the first time, it wasn't Ryan who felt small. It was Coach Miller. The team lowered Ryan to the ground, pats on his back, words of praise surrounding him. But one voice cut through the rest. Ryan. Coach Miller. For a moment, the world shrank. Just the two of them, standing face to face, a battle of unspoken words hanging in the air. The coach's eyes flickered, hesitation, struggle, pride buried beneath years of arrogance. He inhaled sharply, as if the weight of this moment was heavier than any loss he had ever faced. And then, the unthinkable happened. He extended his hand. The same hand that once pointed at Ryan in mockery. The same hand that had once tossed him a football just to watch him fail. Now, it was a hand of respect. Ryan looked at it. The past replayed in his mind. The laughter, the insults, the long nights of pushing himself harder, faster, stronger, just to prove something, just to prove himself. But he didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had already won. So he shook it. Not for Coach Miller, not for validation, but because Ryan had already moved past him. As Ryan walked off that field, he didn't just walk away as a player. He walked away as something more, a legend. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving himself right. And sometimes the greatest strengths are the ones no one ever sees coming. What do you think? Have you ever had to fight to be seen? Have you ever had to prove that you're more than what people believe? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your story. And if Ryan's journey inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Because sometimes the quietest ones are the ones who change the game forever.